Hello everyone, today we talk about the Byzantine Psiloi, one of the most important units in the Byzantine army between, this video ranges roughly between the 6th and the mid 11th century, and we're talking about light infantry essentially, and as we will see there is actually a great variety also of equipment this type of troops, right? And these are the kind of fighters that are often overlooked in the broader economy of forces, especially in a context like the early medieval one, where really, as we've seen many times, material wealth was very low. So light infantry, light cavalry were always, say the most standard type of troops available, and obviously also the ones that you could rely the least on. So talking about the Roman Empire, we look at essentially a power base essentially on a centralized system for times standards, with a professional army that of course had mostly this. There were some reforms over time, but let's say that was a core of the Constantinopolitan army, especially in the latter phase of this period, and however a somewhat still central way of recruiting from the capital, then some provincial armies that could provide, right, as the bulk of the local force, this important amount of heavy troops, cavalry, infantry, and also an important amount of equipment that we will see also, in fact, in the case of the Psiloi, is meant, at least from the manuals, from the instructions of the various imperial various emperors and their their manualistics, right, whatever in the court, etc., that were to be provided with an important equipment, or with a good equipment, right? So we are looking at a period in history where, of course, we know really a few concretely about, let's say, historically and archaeologically, about what the average equipment these troops could be, but what we see especially in the Byzantine tradition, especially in the wake probably of the late Roman one, this idea that after all, individuals, we were talking about it just the other day when speaking of late Roman light cavalry between the 3rd and 6th centuries, so just before this one, but it's similar to this one. This increase, right, towards the training and the care, right, brought properly to form troops in an imperial army, in a sort of, let's say, maybe the term is too much, but in a hyper specialistic sense, is to say individual training of the troops increase in late Roman times, and it's debatable to see how this concretely worked, in the sense that one thing is looking at the dispositive source, like a manual, an issue, whatever, that says, troops should be trained like this and equipped like this, but and what reality was like. This empire, of course, was the most powerful military around, also properly in terms of the standards of the organizational standards, this kind of central, this political control on the armed forces. There is a great change. This is the period of great contraction due to the Islamic invasions and other peoples that pressed, also from the Balkans, etc. So there is, in that sense, an increase, a neat increase towards privatization. There are many private forces properly assigned, also the central government. There are the allies. There are the oligarchs. There is something that we can see as naturally the shrinking and probably even the collapse of a certain type of military organization. But at the same time, there is this idea that the resources are ever more precious, and so in every moment of crisis there is an effort to provide with higher quality, right, rather than quantity, which is evidently not available and or could be counterproductive, even for the sake of simplicity and command, like as a principle of war. Properly, you want less troops but good troops, right? And you can see in this light infantry type, after all, a very important amount of, let's say, in fact, of equipment for those time standards, whether it's an optimistic issue or whether, but the fact that conceptually was realized, they were conceived like that properly, it's still remarkable. So there is also another thing to consider. Here we're talking mainly about archers. The Byzantine Psiloi were factually archers, right? Most of the times, not only, there were also javeliners, there were also slingers, and other things. And this typology of troop is, even in the Greek term, we made a video back in the day on the Hellenistic Psiloi, right? That in ancient times were more something like throwaway skirmishers that you could find plenty of, naturally, in a much different world from that, right? In also less of a settled world, because it was essentially still either the Hellenic polis, but even in the Diadochi kingdoms, there were also all these lots of throwaway troops, like even the Turophoroi from out of foreign ethnicities, and the impoverishment of the middle classes, the large availability of this. Literally, guys could just skirmish without any armor and anything. Something very different from, let's say, the Imperial Army, the Roman Imperial Army in the early Middle Ages. Right. At the same time, you also have to understand the strategic function of these troops. That is, as we will see now, towards the 9th century, it seems that especially archery had somewhat declined. And somebody has said a bit mechanistically, well, this happened because the empire was coming, had resumed the offensive, right? It was re-expanding at that time, which is true. And also proving an impressive, let's say, resilience and continuity with previous military tradition, in a way, with all the changes that had occurred, because factually these armies managed to recover a great deal of territories that had been lost in the previous centuries. And so people say, there were more archers up before, because, when the empire was in a more of a defensive position. So let's say this kind of troops were, the best essentially for defending strongholds, right? And as such, they figured, even culturally from the sources, statistically in a higher way than later, right? And so, as if also archery altogether was declining by that point. We know that level 6 actually says something like this, but we should also be very careful about any kind of generalization in this regard. First of all, because that's as few as we know. Secondly, because it's irrealistic. Right, the importance of archery in the Byzantine Empire in this context has to do also, we explained it many times, with this continuous exposure of the empire to essentially, in fact, mostly not just archery skilled people, but properly horse archers. And think about all the Pontic dimension. I think about the Balkans with the Bulgars, with the Khazars, the Cumans, all throughout all this period, and how massively, especially towards the latter period, like this type of troops, were properly present within the Roman army and settled within Roman territory and so on. We made actually a couple of videos about this. Once it was about the Asiatic cavalrymen, that it was a bit all in general, properly also about the military organization of those peoples, but factually they were present en masse in the Byzantine armies. Then we made another video about the various early medieval auxiliaries that were also enemies, as always, right? Serbs, Bulgars, Georgians, etc. All these troops that figured, one or another in the Byzantine army were factually Byzantine soldiers. And at that point, it doesn't even make sense to distinguish anymore what is, let's say, the Roman copy of certain military styles and the same, literally those same peoples operating in the Roman army, right? And naturally, what I think about the idea of copying, right? It doesn't exist, right? It's a poor way of understanding how civilizations work and how they did. There is an absorption, and if this absorption is successful, it means that already that culture is that civilization is as advanced as the other where it's taking it from, right? And I guess Rome, the Byzantines, etc., displayed this for a very long time to make us reflect properly on importance. And naturally, because they had the means, they were again a state, right? They were a big thing, they were a massive power, and they could afford this in the first place. And the tactical functionality of this light infantry is obvious. In especially fighting against such, you see, yes, at this point the Byzantines fought against rivals that were, after all, not much different from them, also because they were literally, a copy of them, such as the Arab armies that literally fought with chunks of the Roman Empire, right, against Constantinople and so on. So that is a case, in fact, of another state born out essentially of the imitation of the Roman and Persian one in the Caliphate. I mean, that is one of the big territorial sedentary powers with a central state, professional army, and so on. But the majority of peoples that Byzantines confronted with were much lighter, right? Mostly the steppes ones that we were saying before, and or other, mountaineers. I don't know. Think about all the ones of Caucasus or of the Balkans, etc. So normally lighter troops, and therefore, and on very tough grounds, by the way, including in fact mountainous ones and so on, where light infantry is necessary. Right, it's necessary not just tactically, but properly from an operational point of view. These troops are needed to lay waste, to perlustrate, to screen, and so on. So they're available in large numbers. Right, never underestimate in this sense how something that is cheap doesn't mean that on the long run it can not become expensive. Like if you take away too many peasants from their work, you will not really have very productive lands afterwards. I'm making it a bit dramatic, but don't think that this Psiloi could also be recruited from other kind of almost middle class backgrounds, from artisans, but surely they were not very high status individuals for sure, and so they were kind of more expandable, like all light troops fundamentally are, and they are called to perform as a role. And however, they figure preeminently in manuals, and against such types of enemies, they provide you with that tactical flexibility that manages you, especially as missile troops, prevalently, as we've just said, to harass the enemy, to inflict important losses, to think about the value of the bow against enemies that are at large are unarmored, like in the early Middle Ages is fundamentally the case. And that was true also for maybe as likely less as we were saying before, but also for Byzantine troops themselves. I mean, the same Byzantine Psiloi were probably the largest type of troop, or at least as infantry, and they corresponded in a sense to what most enemies could put against them in a way or another, right? Mounted is not even so important, because technically, even if you look at the Slavs, etc., there is always this idea when you have to cope at mounted enemies, especially like the steppes ones, you do need mostly some kind of infantry that can stop, like heavy infantry more than else, that can stop the charges, but also a lot of missiles that at that point can counter the same horse archery of the enemy. Right, so in this sense, the Psiloi in the Byzantine army make a lot of sense, right, considering the enemies that they had to cope with. Always remember that there is no army historically that works just with light troops, right? Even when these are so many, like especially in Central Asian tradition, you see numerically that there is the tiny elite of heavily armored troops and then swarms of horse archers from the subjects peoples and so on. Like it's always a combined arm tactics. Like light troops by definition cannot win battles, right? You cannot win battle just with light infantry, with archers. You always need a stopping power and also an aggressive one in the form of same infantry or cavalry that gets the thing done, which it would shock tactics and combining. And this Psiloi are mostly best used, in fact, in defense and or in guerrilla and skirmishes and things like these. And so they would. We don't know as much, but we naturally understand that most of these troops were recruited a bit from everywhere, because everywhere there were this kind of, lower status individuals who kind of live in the countryside, that they knew how to use a bow, and they already had it in a sense. And yes, there were some extra requirements on how they had to be equipped. It was all kind of privately mediated, especially in the countryside. Like there were some households from the empire that were asked from the empire to maintain, as we'll see now, a certain amount of armament available. These are the normal kind of ways. The militias are organized everywhere, but in fact, this is the point, right? That they were a pretty common type of troop. It's just, as we will see, this we're still within an empire required them to be a bit more scientifically organized and equipped, especially than others. So the idea is that most Psiloi would be as light as literally not wearing even a body armor or helmet, which is maybe not implausible, but say that a minimal form of protection in the form of some kind of organic material, etc., that can do miracles. Some padded armor, some sword, some cap were always more frequent than we think. It's just that they're not frequently depicted, and or when they are, we don't exactly know what the iconographic source is meant to show regarding to the materials which these clothes were composed of. And however, it's important for them to be light, right? So even heat or something can make them underperform, and we often underestimate that. Meaning that, of course, if you are just armed mostly for skirmishing and not closing in and so on, the lighter you are, in a sense, the better it is, right? It's the same philosophy of the horse archer of the steppes. There is arrows everywhere, so you would expect, a lot of armor, right? In those, but instead, no, right? What made the greater effectiveness is, of course, on a collective scale, not an individual one. It is to say, the more, the speedier and the more, effectively you can concentrate volume of fire against the enemy, and the more that will be your shield, your armor. Right, because the enemy will not be able to shoot you back in the same way, and therefore, rather than equipping you for being better protected, you should equip yourself to be more offensive and faster, right, and speedier, literally as an individual. However, certain essentials never come less. For example, a roughly 30 centimeters / 12 inches, circa, diameter shield for protection, albeit the Strategicon in the 6th century says that it was too heavy to be used in battle, which is kind of strange because 30 centimeters in diameter is really ridiculous. It's just typical light infantry shield used to parry a little bit just in case closing in for some reason, or as a minimal form of defense against other projectiles. And Leo VI later on says that actually such shield was forbidden in use, which that essentially Leo follows pretty much the Strategicon in a sense. Certain things he says are also kind of, not everything is completely, it has a logic, it's just that we can't see very often what it is, and it's written mostly as a literary model, so not everything is written there actually has to be rationalized to make sense in the way as moderns would think it does, right? Certain things evidently have no sense. We made videos on Byzantine naval tactics at the time, other things that are recorded, and of course it's more the style, especially at that point in Byzantine history, in its literature, that was the deal, right? Traditionalism, classicism, modelism in a sense, and so we don't have to take it literally for that. So because it doesn't make sense in military history to presume that at a certain point somebody forbid the use of a small shield such as that one for light infantry, right? Probably what it means is that there were some practical reasons for which somebody would say that maybe, as just we were saying before, maybe that shield was useless in the face of some other tactical equipment item or fencing style that just is not explicitated there, right? In a certain tactical situation might have brought you to discard the shield, but for the rest it doesn't make any sense, as a comprehensive logic, right? And in fact, pictorial sources and even a few written ones actually indicate that most Psiloi actually wore, in fact, light helmets, and that shields were larger, right? Even of different form, right? So light mail or lamellar corselets are said to be supplied by the same Byzantine manuals to as many archers as possible when available, right? Albeit these were undoubtedly restricted to heavy units, so here we do not descend into the Byzantine organization on the missile component of the tagmata and so on, but indeed, here when we talk about Psiloi, we're not really talking about units or corps, we're talking literally about a typology of trooper, right? It could also differ technically within the same unit, like as a complement. Right, so we'll see staff slings, javeliners, dartsmen next to archers. Right, archers, like archery requires is a much more technical thing than these other specialties, and it requires a specific training, specific hardware, specific gear. So archers are never are more expensive in general among the various troops. Among the various light troops are usually the most expensive ones, not even necessarily the most effective ones in absolute terms, because there is no such thing in warfare. But let's say sometimes the tactical balance can be shifted. I don't know, more by even by slingers, maybe by javelins. We don't know, right? Or even from these guys actually closing in combat. But let's say that the bowman has this evident capacity we're saying for to inflict important losses with an important level of certainty based on accuracy and precision that are kind of obvious in many situations, especially in defense. As we've seen, it's important to when the enemy exposes itself to fortifications, has to remain a long time under fire to close distances. These guys are really important, a bit like at closer range as snipers and things like these. So they have to be skilled, and the idea that light mail or lamellar corselets that of course were used by these troops, but some of these troops, a minority, definitely a real minority of them, is kind of obvious, right? The idea of a heavier or lighter even archery is what we've seen. In fact, even the other day on the video on late Roman light cavalry, right? It seems that by the 5th century, by Hunnic influence, where in the steppes normally they cared more for that armor protection at some level, aside from the throwaway horse archers, the Romans adopted some kind of heavier armor in fact, these troops that were meant to be light in the first place. So technically everywhere, in every let's say, aside from the various numerical proportions that are what we mathematically try to reconstruct sometimes, even with too much positivism, of course there has always been, let's say, I don't know, a heavy archer, right? What's the point of a heavy archer? Well, the point of a heavy archer is to be heavy not just in armor, but of course to have some kind of hand-to-hand combat capability, especially in assault, right? And or in defense. I mean, let's say, as somebody that you can deploy flexibly, I don't know, in siege warfare, things like these, and that also has to support the heavier infantry literally throwing themselves in the breach, because they have to support them. It's always about combined armed tactics, right? So they have to close in, where or another. And it's plenty, in fact, of instances in warfare where you need to make your missile troops heavier, because they have to follow the heavier troops in the assaults. Right, and so given the importance of archery in siege warfare in general, this kind of appears more evident. So it's interesting. I don't the passage that says that let's say that if any kind of extra armor was available, this had to be given to as many archers as possible. Well, in my opinion, it's contextualized in the idea that, of course, the heavier troops, like those who have like infantry are meant to go into hand-to-hand combat, have to be, of course, the ones equipped with armor, preferably. Let's say, but if there is extra armor, the first troops that should be equipped with that are archers, right? So that does make sense objectively, and it tells how important archers are, right? It just takes even more training. They're more costly, right? It's easier to train a slinger, paradoxically, than an archer. And in fact, some sources show such armored archers, even with waist-length corselets and helmets in fairly large circular shields, right? Always remember that in these contexts, Wu is an archer. Again, Wu is fighting at the moment as an archer, but this may not mean that they are not something else, right? It's like the Roman legionnaires, right? We imagine like stereotypically them just to be the heavy infantry, but actually not, right? That we know perfectly well that in certain tactical contingencies they would even abandon their armor for the sake of speed, of of energy and so on. And even as light troopers, especially when they were to attack the fortifications, it seems strange. I mean, not always really. I mean, to make sudden attacks like commandos or things like that, because they had to be lighter, right? Of course, in full light with, approaching a fortification, you want to be well armored. But let's say that these troops were trained to cover every kind of tactical role when necessary, right? And so obviously the same goes for equipment. There was no such thing like a standardization. Hell, there is not even today, right? Even today, yes, there is a set of equipment you are provided with, but let's say if you have a taste for a certain type of, a machine gun rather than another, whatever, the amount of grenades, there is still that kind of flexibility. And so it was at the time. Of course, these archers could be equipped with heavier equipment, and just think that the archer in itself, the bow itself may be a side weapon, right, for heavier troops. So we're not even told whether, of course, the Psiloi were the only guys equipped with bows, which is often what we forget, right? That even the heaviest of cavalry actually may have as a side weapon a bow, right? And this was normal because, again, lots of people knew how to, even just to bow hunt, even on from horseback. And so why not using that if you had some kind of possibility? And of course, when we have already talked about Byzantine cavalry here and there, but we have to think horse archery there to be more widespread than we think. Even when the tactical typology, the unit was preferably conceived as, heavier type of cavalry and so on. And this for many reasons that have to do also, if you know how the evolution of archery in cataphracts, for example, in the steppe was, it emerged sometimes from the same thing overlapped and eventually split into, depending on mostly political, social background and military organization of these peoples. So the Byzantines were often very close to these cultures, and they also concentrated, as we've seen, a lot of effort in providing with quality the single individual troopers. Of course, the fairly large circular shields are, it's always the same thing. Do you want to be speedier? Do you want to be better protected? Right. This depends on the person, depends on the situation, right? And depends on the availability of equipment too, as an option. And in fact, sometimes, you see practical applications, like, think about the typical late medieval Pavese crossbowman, right? He's a guy who, when reloads his crossbow, turns his back, crouches, and so the back is covered with a Pavese, right? So we find, in fact, even in this Byzantine, as early as it's pretty universal, this Byzantine troops with this fairly large circular shields, usually slung at the back when the bow is in use, right? Because just a way, also a practical way to bring it with you, rather than offering just maybe greater protection because you can't your hands in combat, right? Because you have, first of all, to operate the bow. So if the shield is too large, you can't, that is a problem. And that may have been a reason why also the aforementioned sources were saying, the 30 centimeters diameter shield is, shouldn't be used in these circumstances, because maybe it was, more important to make it quicker with your arms and hands to shoot, rather than protecting yourself at that point. Might have been a minus. Just we don't know. We haven't seen them operating, right? And of course there were armored archers, as we have acknowledged. So the typical kind of Byzantine bow at this point is the composite one, drawn to the chest. But other weapons were present among the Psiloi, as we've just said, such as light or even heavy javelins, which cover basically the same functionality of, especially in sieges, javelins are deadly, right? Heavier ones against armored opponents. That's quite important. Staff slings, the spendobulon, as it was called in Greek, that also are pretty damn they harmful. That much is, they're thrown with both arms. This massive, balls or stones, very very high specific weight. It can, cause devastating trauma underneath the armor. Or still, this kind of more classical sounding weapons that were around, however, definitely, and we often overlook the Marzo-Babula, right? The ancient Marzo-Barbary, right? It's the Latin, eventually Hellenized sounding thing that sometimes people said, these weren't really actual darts. You know what the Marzo-Barbary were? Just basically some darts, right? Like the plumbate were back in the late Roman times, something literally thrown with your hand, with a heavy hand. And there are modern testing about the kind of distance you could, hit, and they were essentially something you could project more than a javelin normally, and apparently, and that were appearing in the Roman army from late Roman times, and they were quite painful as well. And it's just, a different option that you have compared to the others, right? When the Romans kind of increase even their offensive potential tactically wise, and they are also more practical to use. In late Roman times, they were lodged within the interior of the shield, etc. And some say there were maces, though, as well, at this point. So the terminology naturally it's Perlinian, and it doesn't actually have this scientific category. I don't know whether it's proper English, but let's say that we think. But yeah, I mean, there could be different things. The concept of dart is very wide, right? Sometimes even in Middle Latin, you find these terms like missilia, or that you don't. It's not specified whether they're crossbow bolts or they are javelins, etc. It depends really mostly on what's the context at the time. You can't simply guess from the most widespread type of weapons that existed at the time. And at this point, yes, I mean, the fact that darts were there, yes, why not? Archers were often issued in addition with a sling as well. Not necessarily a staff one. There are representations inserted here iconographically too of literally, well, mostly from, as you can imagine, from David and Goliath art with properly literally normal slings. And having such a reserve missile weapon was important because at the end of the day, the sling is smaller. The bow has it simply occupies more space. It requires even just the arrows, or you don't find them everywhere. Like with a sling, you can throw stones, and you can find more easily than that. Actually, manuals even say that these troops should train in literally throwing stones by hand, right? Which is never to be underestimated. How heavy and impacting such practice was. You would expect, stone, what are we, primitives. Actually, if you study old medieval history, and I mean even in the most advanced, militarily advanced Western realities in the late Middle Ages, you actually know that these people threw stones, like, yes, mostly in sieges, right? That was the only way, not normally in pitched battles, but still so. In that there were so many, and also in urban battles, right? There were reserves of stones that sometimes you couldn't really stop, and it was actually a pretty serious thing, and they could achieve very, very high tactical effectiveness, especially when combined with darts, missiles of other type. During sieges was pretty much the norm. Literally, having stones on the walls and throwing them against people that were climbing from the ladders, and so it was just there. Exploiting gravity and all, but also in literally on the same plan, like in squares, like in places where you could, even when there was other weapons were prohibited, right? You could still find stones where in medieval settlements and so on. And there's another weapon that is the Solenarian. It's a sort of crossbow. We will see it in a separate video to describe what it is. This thing came about right? Mostly they spread since late Roman times in a consistent fashion, but crossbows existed since, think about the Gastrofatus, they were there since ancient times, and actually were there before the massive low medieval revival of them. You can find crossbows even in Pictish Scotland this time. And they were around late Roman time. The fact that they're not so documented doesn't mean that they didn't exist. After all, there is not really a great technical engineering capacity behind the concept of a crossbow, right? It's that simple. The Solenarian, there were different types, probably even here, just a type of weapon, but it could be subtypes of how they were drawn. The crossbows, the Solenarian could be even sometimes a bow with an increased guide for the arrow, right? That would channel better, increase precision. Other times with literally a crossbow, and even in here in the temporal gaps, we don't see, for example, we can't trace concretely the continuity of its use. For example, after the mid-10th century, we don't find many references to such crossbows in Byzantine use, right? So that we say that they were eventually reintroduced by the Normans during the Crusades in the late 11th century, when Anna Komnena calls the weapon by the name Zangre in Greek. And however, in my opinion, it's kind of ridiculous to presume that just because we don't have any other evidence, like it's because factually that kind of weapon had fallen in use for some reason. I don't think so. I don't think there is a concrete evidence for saying that. And on the contrary, I believe that was probably even a development during that time, because actually heavy cavalry was increasing in importance, and for that matter, crossbows are very, very effective anti-horses weapons. But even against armor itself, properly against the horsemen. So I presume that there weren't actually many differences between East and West. If you see what, at this point at least, because later on the West will overly expand the crossbow capacities and but also because they had increased dramatically their heavily armored cavalry size. So at this point instead, especially if you look at Byzantine equestrian culture and all the various armor types, etc., they were more or less at the same level of development of the Westerners. The same goes for shields, for the oval one, the kite-shaped one. We find them in parallel between East and West, and say, there was obviously a reciprocal influence at some level, but not necessarily a derivative one. That is to say, for all the warfare that these peoples made at home, like there is hardly any reason for which they should have, at some point discovered another type of shield. I mean, it's just a shield, right? There are not many ways you can conceive a shield, right? The same goes for bows, right? So never think that, again, this obsession that we have for cultural appropriation, which is as dumb as properly not understanding what the sap of civilization is, for which somebody has to learn just from another, right? If you're talking about, I don't know, the Spanish with the Native Americans, the word civilization separated by thousands of years of development. But if you're talking about 10th century Europe, like you don't kind of, we're basically the same thing everywhere in the technologies and their constant contact. I mean, there is not a moment where somebody began to show others how to do things, right? And so the use of the bow itself seems to have undergone a decline during the 9th century, what we were saying at the beginning, because the same Leo VI was trying to fix that, right? We don't know whether even this is actually true. Some have proposed that since the empire was coming to expand again, there wasn't such defensive need of archery, defensive needs for archery to be so largely employed. So it was not much about organizing the defense through archery, but actually attacking through heavily armored troops. It doesn't make much sense, right? There were certain universal essentials, like missile troops were present everywhere at every time. They served both in attack and defense. I don't believe that. There might have been some kind of maybe laxity in the kind of the specific in the military organization took over the fact that maybe somebody had not cared about archery, but in contexts where, again, were kind of more doctrinal dispositive, where literally the state had to take care, for example, of the supplies or things like that, but not because archery, in terms of tactical practice, had declined. Right? I don't believe it. Doesn't make any sense. The Byzantines were keeping to fight against ever more missile offensive, let's say, peoples. Right? At this point, the Turks were spreading in the east. From the steppes, the Balkans were still, important bows capacities. Probably also the West was developing something more offensive already. So maybe the fact that Leo VI wanted to reintroduce, let's say, and enforcedly so, such archery practice, it just means that he wanted to have more capable archers, not that archery itself had declined doctrinally in use, right? And in fact, this is the most practical, the most sensible explanation, in my opinion. It's interesting that enforced archery practice was issued also for those who were exempt from military service, right? So this means that they wanted to have ever more archers available, even as a pool of recruitment. And this is important because it does actually show the need of the empire to expand again, and for which you actually need such troops. But let's say this again could have occurred just because they needed more troops, not because archery for the way it worked was kind of negative. In practice, also these were, this issue was unitly for types of troops such as archers didn't need such a dramatic military skills. So the non-military personnel could still be brought in combat with a lower level of training, just for shooting with their bows, whereas the heavier troops needed, were already framed as a type of units in a more structured training for more central structures, and so that thing had not declined, whereas now they just needed, again, more troops, maybe from the countries of the peasantry that could know how to use a bow and to be equipped accordingly. In fact, Leo instructs his generals that often took matters in their own hands, even in terms of recruitment. It was, could receive public funds, but it also was largely, by proxy. So that is to say that they were just entrusted some amounts of lands and their local resources and training structures to ensure that every household in the empire, so literally every fireplace, possessed a bow and 40 arrows. And seemingly, however, this thing didn't work, right? It's too socially engineering. It's not, they probably didn't have the coercive capacity, but at the time was just like telling them that just do your best regarding to this thing because you're gonna need those. And this is just if you want, even a literary thing, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it's not that what is written in Leo's tactic actually corresponds to a massive reformation need for such thing to change. It's actually, the thing probably went up and down by dynamics that we can't even trace, and are maybe not even connected to the one described by Leo, but still, we take it as useful information. So 40 was the usual number of arrows held in a quiver. It could be also as many as 60, probably were different sizes, of course. We have seen the ones with the steps were often overloaded in theory with lots of, but it's importantly, 40, 60 arrows it's not a few, even just materially speaking at the time. You need some kind of work at least behind that, and of cost. And it does show the importance of archery altogether. I mean, and what could be the role in a battle? Because if you have just in one quiver, so now if you're not talking about the supplies, the stocks, etc., but literally, and sometimes there were also more quivers, 40, 60, you have already for, 1,000 of this guy, a quite effective, quite impressive volume of fire, right? Especially these considered they are infantrymen. They stand firm. They probably received enough training, at least in open field, to launch the various volleys in an orderly fashion to maximize the effect at parity of arrows shot on the end for softening up the enemy formation. So you can imagine what approaching a Byzantine army in that sense would be, like a shower of arrows that surely would put in crisis also most cavalry, I presume, because that's mostly the horses, as we've seen, largely unarmored, were the biggest and easiest target, right? And they had a lot to shoot down for the steppes, like it's like cowboys and Indians in as a perspective. And plus, there is naturally an offensive, hand-to-hand combat capacity of these guys, right? And Silla's secondary armament consisted of a Paramarian or Tzikurian, it is kind of axe, a light axe, single-handed axe, and or other weapons like daggers or even swords, we'll see. Now, Nicephorus II Focus, 963-969, lists a complete Psiloi equipment as 2 bows, 4 bow strings, 2 quivers containing 40 and 60 arrows, small shield, sword, Tzikurian, and sling. And if you take it all together, this is, as we were saying before, they're not just like throwaway troops, right? This maybe is an ideal equipment, that is to say, what these guys had to be supplied with, ideally at the beginning of a campaign, to be provided from the imperial stocks, or for them to bring from their own private households when they were recruited and so on. And the sword, the shield, the axe, the sling, the 2 bows, 2 quivers. It's not just a few. This is not the typical complete light throwaway infantryman that you just send in hoping that they're gonna mediate a bit the clash between the heavier troops. This is quite of an offensive type of trooper. It's very well suited for especially for defending fortifications. It's offensive in the sense that it can also close in hand-to-hand combat with a sword, with an axe, right? And it has a different capacity because slings can throw against, can be effective against armor, the trauma underneath, that there are lots of arrows for taking out lightly armored opponents. So it's a complete, it's the best, if you want. The Byzantines were a bit theoretical in a positivistic sense. It's something they inherited from the Greeks in general, but in these manuals and in this general view of what the troops had to be, so dispositions are something, reality is something else. Probably most of these troops were not at all equipped as well as this, but in theory they had to be. So the functionality of these troops is also to be regarded how it was seen in theory by the rulers of the empire, right? There was a role that they had to fulfill. It was not a secondary one in their idea, right? Having a lot of these guys meant to have a good pairing and offensive capacity for the heavier troops to go in combat. For some reason, Psiloi were expected to keep their hair short. Might have been a reason of not, with all those strings and not to get some cutting pulling their hair in the meanwhile, things like these. And next to these troops, we have also to account for, if we want to insert them as a troop typology in general, other types of troops with, let's say, with a similar capacity, such as that we could define as servants or as field aides, right? That were literally not conceived to go at wars as properly as soldiers as such, but as part of the retinues of important individuals, generals, officers, and etc. They may have supported the army in combat also in similar ways. So slings were probably the cheapest weapon in terms of, but also importantly effective in cost-benefit ratio. If these guys were to do nothing else, at least they could be slingers. And these were literally throwaway troops in a sense, but they could support here and there. the servants would have been less uniform in appearance than Psiloi, that were literally framed within the army as troops were trained, were supplied in a specific way. And we think a typical servant would have not brought a shield or a helmet either. But these are all, in fact, theoretical speculations. It depends. We're not there. There are just different degrees of how this could have been at any moment. And so this rabble would fundamentally support a little bit more the heavier troops, right? And as we were saying before, light infantry doesn't make it alone, so it doesn't matter how impacting, especially from a numerical point of view, and given their volume of fire, the Psiloi, of course, they were something auxiliary, right, in nature. But it's important to stress there were before we talk about the Sikuri and the axe, but also there were sabers, so kind of weapons that are very useful in close combat. Of course, when you the Paramarian, as I said before, is such weapon, and they of course, I always think of siege warfare, right? Because in open field you don't quite have a chance to use these troops thinking they're gonna hold for a long time. Like you can maybe use them to outflank the enemy while the enemy is pinned down, engaged in another heavier unit. And normally battles were fought a bit like this. You know, if you manage to outshoot and to overwhelm the enemy, the light infantry that normally operated on the flanks or in the front, let's say around the heavier troops, you could use this lighter troops eventually to outflank the enemy when their own support, the support of the enemy enemy light troops had collapsed as well. So attacking from the rear, overwhelming them with mass rather than something else. So in that sense, they were equipped for closer combat and they could have been useful, but in general you could have not hoped from them to withstand a cavalry charge. Doesn't matter whether maybe a light one, of course, but that's also not what kind of that our troops do. Like at that point it's not important even if they're mounted or dismounted, they're kind of trying to annihilate each other in the same way. Of course somebody on horseback has an important advantage, but normally infantry are more, at least if you fight against sedentary people. The horse archers of steppes, as we've seen, were there in large numbers as well, so it really depends. But you don't expect a Psiloi to fight against a heavily armored opponent, right? So the only way they can, in a sense, is to be useful in that sense, is to be on a stronghold walls to essentially to support even in there the heavier troops, and also to inflict some important damage to the approaching enemy that at that point is probably under, they have some protection, but they're under fire. They have to approach the fortifications in that fashion. So that's basically it. Then we will talk about Byzantine tactics a bit more. This is just about the unit type, right, video, but we will also observe how these troops operated in light in various battles, mostly the largest, but they're usually underdocumented, right, if anything. But for now, we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.